Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today we're going to be talking all about low-cut filters. When should you use them? How much should you use them? Should you use them on everything? Should you put them on no matter what? Should you only put them on certain elements? Should you always put them on certain elements? Should you only put them on if you can hear exactly what the low-cut filter is doing? Are there cases where you'd put them on even if you can't hear the low rumbly stuff that the low-cut filter is supposed to take out? Do you use them in mastering? Should I be using them in mixing? Is it okay to use them in recording? I'm going to answer all those questions and a lot more in this week's episode that's all about low-cut filters, or as some people like to call them, high-pass filters, which is slightly more confusing, but also true. I'm going to go with the more colloquial low-cut. Even though high-pass makes you sound smart, and they both mean the same thing, I'm going to say low-cut filters. So I got some answers to this, and there's some controversy. It's a question that comes up a bit. I just did a live Q&A for my Mastering Demystified students. The question came up there, how to use low cuts in mastering. I just did a private tutorial lesson, private kind of tutoring session, coaching call for one of my mixing clients, and question came up there as well. And I've seen conflicting advice in different videos and articles about it online. So I want to give you a sense for how different people use it and how I might recommend you use it. We'll talk about in recording, we'll talk about in mixing, we'll talk about in mastering. If you want me to do all that, you got to do just one thing for me, and that is to ever so lightly tap the like button if you're on the YouTubes. And if you're on one of the audio-only versions like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, one of those, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It totally helps us get this podcast out there to more people. So big thanks to you for that. And the quickest of shout outs to our sponsors, including Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Also Steinberg, makers of Cubase, possibly the most powerful and flexible DAW in the universe, as well as other great software like Wavelab, like Nuendo, like Doracode, music notation software, and a really killer line of interfaces as well. Check them out, steinberg.net. All right, let's get into this question of low cutting. First, in the recording context, should you use low cuts in the recording context? I'm a big fan of committing to things as you're getting them, making things sound right going in. So, yes, you can use low-cut filters in the recording process. And there's certain elements where you might just want to go ahead and use them. But in order to commit to things as you're going in, you've got to really learn to trust yourself. And you've got to be able to trust what you're hearing. So you want to be in a decently well-tuned room, or you will want to have gotten some experience playing around with low cuts first, perhaps in a mixing situation. And even if you're not finishing mixes, if you're the kind of person who's recording things and then sending them off to someone more experienced than you to mix, you should always be doing rough mixes of everything that you work on, even if you're not the final mixer on it, because it gives you an opportunity to play around with these things and see what harms and what helps. So I'm going to be focusing today mostly on the mixing context. We'll also talk about low cuts and mastering, where they are used sometimes. And in doing so, I think the same kind of advice we give about using low cuts in mixing is going to apply to low cuts as well in recording. So here are the kinds of elements where I'd be inclined to always use them. Things like hi-hats. So if you are multi-miking a drum kit and one of the elements is a hi-hat, you do not need 60 hertz in your hi-hat. You do not need 100 hertz in your hi-hat. You do not need 200 hertz in your hi-hat. Probably the fundamental of your hi-hat is likely not to be any lower than 300 hertz, although it depends. So you could set a relatively high low-cut filter on a hi-hat and not damage things and potentially help things. Because what are you getting rid of when you get rid of 100 hertz and below on a hi-hat? Well, you're getting rid of all of the kick drum bleed and tom fill bleed and all of that stuff. You might also take a similar approach to rolling off really low elements in a bottom snare mic or a top snare mic. Chances are you don't need your 60 hertz in your bottom snare mic. And again, it's just going to be bleed from other things. And when you cut out some of the low frequencies from these elements that clearly don't need them because they don't have any of their own low frequency content, you're probably going to tighten up the other low frequency elements that are there. So that's something to think about. A similar thing could be true of vocals. Is there any 40 hertz in that female vocal? No. But there might be rumble of like a truck going by, or just breathing sounds, or just kind of ambient background noise. So yeah, you could set a low cut on a vocal. But not always and not in all contexts. My voice, especially if I'm making sure to speak through my diaphragm and not just through my nose, if I'm speaking in a chesty way, or if I'm speaking kind of normally, I have fairly deep fundamentals in my voice. I'd have to look at it on a frequency spectrum analyzer, but there probably is, in this spoken word context, some genuine, could be 60 hertz material in my voice. Definitely 70 and 80. Depending on the male speaker you might be dealing with, there could be stuff happening at 50 and 60 hertz. So you don't want to just roll off everything willy-nilly. But if you were trying to fit my voice into a really dense mix, or just make it sound really bright and clear, you might want to get rid of a bunch of that stuff down there, especially if we're talking about a dense mix. Because that 50 and 60 and 80 hertz that might actually sound nice on my voice in a spoken word context or in a really sparse mix might not do you any good at all and just detract from things in a dense mix. So this is a principle here, that you can do more, you can get away with doing more, and you might be inclined to do more low cutting depending on the density of the mix. The denser the mix gets, the more low cutting you can get away with, and the more low cutting that might actually be asked for. Whereas in a really sparse mix, where it's just an acoustic guitar on one side and a mandolin, or an organ on the other, and then a vocal down the center, maybe you don't want to touch with a low cut filter at all. And if you're doing it, maybe you're doing it 20 hertz or 30 hertz just because you think, maybe there's some rumbly stuff there I don't need. I'm not sure. So it really depends. Low cutting is contextual, and I don't recommend just doing it as a matter of course. However, there are some elements where you might do it as a matter of course. Snare bottom mic, hi-hat mic, when you're recording a whole band together. And this also might change if you're recording a whole band together and there's a bleed between things. So an electric guitar amp that you're recording by itself, it might not really matter whether or not you low cut it if you're recording it by itself in an isolated way. Maybe that electric guitar isn't putting out any energy below 100 hertz. Could you low cut stuff below 100 hertz? Yeah. Is it likely to make much of a difference? No. But as soon as that electric guitar amp is in a context where there might be bleed from other elements into it, then all of a sudden low-cutting stuff below 100 hertz might make more sense, might be more desirable, might be more necessary, because now there's bleed from the bass amp, or bleed from the drums in the next room, or bleed from a singer, or whatever it is in that electric guitar mic. Now, some people will argue that there are potentially, just background ambience and other stuff that you might not be able to hear, and you may as well just low cut that. Okay, sure, do it. You can. Should you low cut things if you can't hear the change? That's a tough question. What kind of speakers are you listening on? Are you listening on Oratones, like the ones here over my left shoulder? Those speakers shouldn't put out much below 100 hertz at all. Depending on the model, it could be higher than that they're not putting out much. Should you be making low-cut decisions on one of those? Maybe not. Maybe you shouldn't be making decisions about what's going on 50 and 60 hertz if that's all you had to listen on. If you really can't trust the low end in your room or on your speakers, it becomes a real question. I will tell you that I'd give you the advice of don't boost what you can't hear. But don't cut what you can't hear. That's a different question. And if you really think, hey, this element right here, this electric guitar, I can't really hear what's going on below 80 hertz on it because I can't really trust below 80 hertz, but it looks like on a frequency chart it doesn't have much going on there, I may as well just cut it. Then yeah, cut it. But you're going to make much better decisions about low cutting if you can get yourself into a situation where you can actually hear what's going on. And I will tell you that there are definitely mixes I get into mastering, and this is where it comes in handy in mastering, where they should have low cut things and they didn't because they couldn't hear what was going on down low. So there's a whole lot of extra spilkish and murk down there that if they low cutted what they couldn't hear, it could have helped them. So I get the advice of, hey, just as a matter of course, low cut things that don't really have or aren't supposed to have a lot of low frequency content information because it might benefit the mix. And even though you can't hear on your system how it's improving things, it is actually improving things. And that can be true. Case in point, if you get records to you mixed by someone who mixed only on NS10s and had nothing else but NS10s to mix on, you may find that they have very good volume relationships, balance relationships through the mid-range, but then the whole 60 hertz area, 80 hertz area, they clearly had no idea what was going on. Chances are there's way too much of it because they were doing boosts that they couldn't hear and they were boosting things below 100 hertz, not realizing how much it was bringing up 60 and 80 hertz because they couldn't hear them on their Yamaha NS10s. And there's all this stuff going on the low end. And then it's my job as a mastering engineer to help them clean up that low end and help do some cutting that they didn't do on their end. And this can actually be where low cuts become an essential thing in mastering. And if you go back and you listen to a lot of like indie rock records done in the 80s and 90s, and even some major rock releases from like the 90s, you'll hear that they have a surprisingly low amount of low end. Like there's not a lot of low end. There's not a lot of sub information. There's not a lot going on down below 80 hertz. And there's two reasons for this. One, these might be the kinds of bands who are recording to 15 IPS tape. That's 15 inches per second. So the tape machines that a lot of rock bands were using had something called a head bump, where it would naturally filter out frequencies below, say, 50 or 60 hertz, with a little bit of a bump around 50 or 60 hertz, but then things below 50 or 60 hertz got rolled off. So that's one of the reasons that, some older rock records don't have a ton of sub information. Another reason is that they were mixed on systems and mixed in rooms where even professional rooms didn't have as good low-end response in a lot of cases as a really well outfitted bedroom studio could today. I mean, how far speaker technology has come, how far the availability of acoustic treatment has come in so many ways is profound. And you outfitting with spending a couple of $1,000s outfitting your room and speakers can have remarkably good results in the low end compared to people who are working at a professional level in some contexts, not all of them, but in some contexts decades ago. So there's a twofold reason that some of these older records don't have a ton of low end. One, potentially the sound of the tape machine filtering out some lows. And two, potentially that they couldn't make great decisions about the low end. So when the record got to the mastering engineer, they used a somewhat aggressive amount of additional low cut filtering on the low end. And it's not uncommon for a mastering engineer to put in a low cut at 20 hertz or 25 hertz or 30 hertz or 35 hertz, or I've done it as high as 40 and 45 hertz on one record. I even went as high as 50 hertz on a low cut because it needed it and it sounded better that way. And that's what the record needed. But there's some genres in which you would almost never do that in mastering, like a hip hop record. Oh my God, would I ever likely low cut at 40 hertz on a hip hopper EDM track? Probably not. But there are some rock tracks, depending on what people are referencing, where that kind of thing, 35, 40 hertz cut on the low end might be appropriate and might make it idiomatic and might clean up some of the stuff that they didn't know was going on in the low end. People who can really hear things in the mix, maybe I'm just doing 20 hertz or 25 hertz low cut, 30 hertz, or maybe none at all. But low cutting can come up in mastering. And it's often in situations where people couldn't hear what was going on in the low end. So what you have there just isn't very good to work with. Where there's a problem with the room in the recording, the actual recording environment had low end that kind of skewed things, or you have a troublesome instrument like a kick drum or an upright bass that wasn't tuned or recorded or performed particularly well, and maybe some low cutting needs to start happening. And maybe in some of those cases, if those mixing engineers could hear the low end a little bit better and did a little bit more low cutting themselves on some elements, you'd have a cleaner, tighter low end. So the question of should you cut the low end or should you not is a hard one to answer precisely. Maybe yes, maybe no. In dense mixes, you do it more. In sparse mixes, you do it less. On elements where there's clearly no low information, you're probably not losing anything by low cutting on them. However, the one biggest takeaway is get yourself into a listening/studio environment where you can confidently answer this question for yourself, because you can with confidence hear what's happening in the low end. And you have accurate information in your room, in your speakers, and in your ears about what's going on below 80 hertz, and below 70 hertz, and below 60 hertz, and below 50 hertz, and ideally below 40 hertz. If you can get it even lower than 40 hertz, great. But if you can hear accurately what's happening around 40 and 50, you're doing fantastic in your room. So that's what I'd encourage you to do, is not fret too much about the specific question. Use some of these principles, use some of these ideas, but fret a little bit more about, I want to be able to answer this question by myself through experimentation, through trial and error. And the only way I can do that is if I can trust my low end. And the only way I can do that is, yes, speakers can help, but an even bigger component is going to be room layout, speaker layout, room treatment, that kind of thing. And in pursuit of that goal, yes, your speakers matter, they make a difference, but what makes even more of a difference than that is how they're placed in the room, is the acoustic treatment that you put up in the room, the amount of bass trapping and broadband absorption you're able to do to get a better sense for what's happening in the lows so you can answer that question with confidence. And if instead of investing so much time into the question of, tell me the answer, should I low cut or not low cut? Invest that time, that mental energy in solving a different puzzle, the puzzle of what you're hearing in your room. So you can ask yourself that question and answer that question for yourself in each unique case. And that is the real answer to, should I low cut or not? You got to trust your gut. But the only way you can trust your gut is if you can trust your ears. And the only way you can trust your ears is if you can trust what you're hearing in your room. So that's my advice to you. I hope it's useful stuff. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. I got some free stuff for you before you go. If you want more with me and you want more mixing advice and really a whole system to mixing, a roadmap to getting the mix right every time in less time with more confidence than ever before, I got a full-length course called Mixing Breakthroughs. But if you want the free version, get the 5 habits of truly great mixers. You can get that at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits for the 5 habits of truly great mixers. Some really life-changing stuff in there. If you prefer to learn a little bit more about mastering, I have a full-length course called Mastering Demystified, but you can also get the free version there at sonicscoop.com/mastering101. That is sonicscoop.com/mastering101. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Another big shout out to you for smashing that like button and for commenting down below. What do you like to do low cuts on? What do you like to leave alone? Do you have your own thought process and principles about this? I want to hear from you in the comments here on the YouTube version, or if you want to email me, you can shoot me an email at podcast@sonicscoop.com. Yes, I do, in fact, read every single one, and you can ask new questions of the podcast there at podcast@sonicscoop.com or in the comments. So smash that like button, hit the notifications bell, subscribe, all that good stuff. And a big shout out to Sound Toys as well for sponsoring this episode of the podcast, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. Check out anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Also, Steinberg. Check them out, steinberg.net. Makers of some of the most powerful software out there for recording, mixing, mastering, editing, stuff like Cubase, Nuendo, Wavelab, Dorico, the music notation software, and a great line of interfaces too. Check them out, steinberg.net. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.